Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you, who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Boscombe Valley was mysterious, Shoscombe Place was old, and the lodge was hysterical, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Was Holmes more of a tea drinker or a coffee fancier? And what are all of the alcoholic drinks mentioned in the stories?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 289, A Study in Speech. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, I am very carefully studying your speech today, so you better watch your mouth.
It's easy because one of the things that powers a good deal of my vocal presentation is the little-known fact that I have resonance where my brains ought to be.
Well, you are resonant, and even some days you are consonant. Although I will not talk about your
inconsonant.
We're not here to talk about your vowel movements, Bert.
Well, actually, we are here to talk about vowel movements.
And inconsistent consonants. That's John Watson, who was experienced with women of three separate consonants. I don't know. Well, we're
off to a very good start.
This is horrible. Yeah. Well, just a reminder, the show notes for this episode can be accessed at ihose.co/trifles289. That'll take you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website, where you can find an archive of all of our shows and sign up to be notified via email when new ones come out. And, of course, you can subscribe to us on whichever podcasting platform you choose. We do appreciate your support. We have a Patreon button there if you'd like to support us for as little as $1 a month. It just goes toward our creative process and production and keeping all of our Patreon fans in line as well. So, if you would like to join in, please feel free to visit our site and check us out. And of course, always tell other people about the show. You are our greatest asset. Well, this episode is really interesting to me because it was recommended to us by a fan, by a listener. In fact, someone who is one of our patrons. Anna Brindisi-Behrens wrote to us and suggested that we cover what she had just written up for Canadian Holmes, A Study in Speech, the use of lisps in the Sherlock Holmes canon and beyond. And I just want to say, Anna, first of all, thank you so much for suggesting this topic. It's not one that we had come across before, and it is fascinating. And we're going to send you a little thank you gift for not only being a patron, but also contributing to our content here. And if any other folks would like to recommend some topics for us here on Trifles, we'd be certainly open to hearing from you. And if we do use your topic, we will send you a little thank you gift as well. So Anna's history is interesting. She is a speech-language pathologist, and she happens to be the co-founder of the Monadnock Sherlockians, which is a society of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts in Keene, New Hampshire. And Anna had some really interesting points on speech therapy and speech impediments, as it were. and how they actually made their way into the Sherlock Holmes stories. And we're not going to talk about the rest of the Conan Doyle canon because there's plenty to go on there, but we will concentrate just on the Sherlock Holmes stories. So I suppose, Bert, we should begin with just some kind of ground rules or some basics in terms of speech pathology. Does that sound good to you?
Yes, yeah, that sounds fine. Yeah, let's press on with that.
Let's press, indeed. Well, what's interesting to me is that when Anna talks about kind of a history of speech pathology in Conan Doyle and his contemporaries, she actually names people we know Conan Doyle corresponded with in many cases, who also used lisps in their own writing. Dickens, for example. He spelled out his character Mrs. Sleary's lisps in Hard Times, where he puts a TH in there instead of an S. Don't say nothing, squire. What doth your friend say? Oscar Wilde, in The Picture of Dorian Gray, used a lisp in a positive trait, describing his character, Mrs. Erlyn, as a pushy nobody with a delightful lisp and Venetian red hair. I like the addition of Venetian red hair there. Rudyard Kipling in The Brushwood Boy in 1907 instructs his character how not to lisp. And P.G. Wodehouse, probably one of my favorite examples here, in Golf Without Tears in 1922, instructed his character how to lisp. It was I who had given her her first driver and taught her infant lips to lisp for. It's not easy to lisp the word for, but I had taught her to do it, and this constitutes a bond between us which has been strengthened rather than weakened through the passage of time. So, and Anna writes that today a lisp is a speech disorder where the S is pronounced much like the TH in thin, and the Z is pronounced like the TH in this. Specifically, a lisp is any atypical articulation of the sibilants, such as the pronunciation of S and Z with the tongue protruding out between the teeth. And that is called a lingual or frontal lisp. And then she goes down a list of, I guess 4 or 5 other types of lisps. You wanna enumerate those for us, Bert, or articulate them?
Well, yes. It's fascinating because I didn't realize that there were so many causes, although as we will discuss, the mechanics of speech, the production of vowel sounds, the placement of the tongue and the teeth, all of that, really 2 things. One is it had a real vogue and a real series of connections in Victorian England because of the general interest in science. But also, particularly in speech in Britain in that time, and even today, there are social distinctions associated with the way one speaks and the way one uses words. And it's just fascinating. But to your point, among the many things that I had no idea of in this paper, which is really fabulous, by the way, because, as you point out, it does talk about things we're not going to get into, such as the appearance of lisping and its association with characters in the rest of the literature of Conan Doyle, which is substantial, which I had absolutely no idea of. I've never paid any attention to it. But she does go on to enumerate, as you suggested, the dentalized lisp, so when the tongue is raised so that the breath is emitted laterally along the sides of the tongue, it is referred to as a lateral lisp. There is a nasal lisp, which is more rare, occurring when the part of the entire airstream is directed through the nasal cavity. That's fascinating. I imagine this would be a great use for actors, too, in terms of creating characters. A palatal lisp is where the speaker attempts to make an S when the middle of the tongue is in contact with the soft palate and results in a posterior articulation of the sound, almost like inhaling S and Z sounds. And a strident lisp results in a high-frequency whistle. And, she points out that this is what we know today, but when Conan Doyle was writing, the term lisp may have been used more generally.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's fascinating. And so much of my own reference to these different speech pathologies actually comes from Mel Blanc. And, his use, and I'm not only thinking of Daffy Duck and Sylvester, their whole sufferance succotash routine there. And Mel Blanc often said that the difference in doing those two voices is that Sylvester's was more of a slobbery, kind of sloppy thing, which mimicked his the construction of his face, while Daffy's was a tighter, kind of more lip-based kind of lisp that mimicked his bill. And I just thought that was a fascinating discernment in character development based on their physical attributes. So I can see how this would actually help them. But speaking of connecting to acting, I think we've got a couple of fascinating instances here. First of all, we know that this notion of speech pathology as a science really didn't come into its own until the 1940s, when we had who is it?
Thinking about 1944 and
Lionel Logue. Yeah, Lionel Logue from the King's Speech fame. He formed the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, so there was formal training that had been established at that point. But even further back than then, and this is a really interesting connection for Sherlockians, we know that William Gillette, after he graduated from high school, was looking to apprentice in the theater, and he became attached to an actor and producer by the name of Raymond, John T. Raymond, who had picked up a play of Mark Twain's and eventually taken it to Boston and was playing at the Globe Theater. Well, Gillette went with him from the Nook Farm area of Hartford to Boston, and during his year in Boston, this would have been about 1875, 1876, young William Gillette submitted himself to the academic profession. This was his only truly formal education following high school, and that means that when he was in Boston, he was attending Boston University's School of Oratory for a year. And it was, he worked on things like culture of the speaking voice, articulation, the science of pronunciation, expressive reading, declamation, gesture, oratorical action, and the dramatic art. And when you think about William Gillette having taken those courses and trained himself more formally in the art of acting, it almost goes against what we know of Gillette and his style of acting, which was very natural. He spoke his lines in a way that would feel like it's someone who was in real life just speaking. You don't know what your next line is going to be because it hasn't been written yet. You're just speaking. And his approach to acting was very, very deconstructed that way. And, you think about all these courses he took at Boston University at the time. It was fascinating to think of that. And while we're on the subject of oratory and Boston University, Alexander Graham Bell was a professor at that very School of Oratory at Boston University during that very same time. Boston University in 1875 advanced him a year's salary to go work on his telephone at the time. And of course, he was working with deaf students and training people in the art of, some kind of the physiology and elocution aspect of speech.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Well, there is quite a history there. Bell's father, Melville Bell, developed a system called visible speech, which was a way of communicating to people how vowel sounds can be properly formed and delivered as part of speech. And that gave rise to, among other things, Professor Higgins in George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, which eventually became the musical My Fair Lady, because really Higgins, that character who's trying to teach a Cockney flower girl to form her speech like a duchess, which is really what the heart of that story is all about, was in a way inspired by Melville Bell's visible speech. And then Bell, as you say, went on to take a couple of wrong turns, but eventually brought to life the telephone, which I guess then gave us the internet. And look where we are.
Well, there we go. Well, let's ring this bell while we still can from our sponsor, and when we come back, we'll talk about lisps in the canon. Stay with us. The Baker Street Journal was first published in 1946, and its old series extended through 1949. It picked up again in 1951 and has been publishing ceaselessly every quarter since then. Every issue of the BSJ is packed with top-notch papers that reflect the sensibilities of Sherlockians from throughout the world. They might be scholarly in nature, giving us details on an aspect of Victorian life that maybe we weren't aware of. They might be tongue-in-cheek, that approach to the game where we wink at each other as we acknowledge Dr. Watson as the true author of the stories and try to figure out some inconsistency. Or they might be something that we never thought was related to Sherlock Holmes, and the author brings it all together for us. Whatever the approach, they're all represented in the Baker Street Journal. Plenty of varying opinions and researches on the world of Sherlock Holmes. Make sure you get on the subscription list to get your copy of the Baker Street Journal delivered to your mailbox every quarter by going to bakerstreetirregulars.com today. All right, we are back talking about speech in the canon, specifically lisps as they made their way through the Sherlock Holmes stories. And this is interesting to me, Bert. Anna notes that Conan Doyle used lisps in his characters in a variety of ways. What are some of those ways in which he used lisps?
Well, it really is fascinating. And again, just to remind our listeners, we're referring to a great paper that's in the summer 2022 edition of Canadian Holmes. She points out that in people with great beauty, a character in a case or in a story written by Arthur Conan Doyle, a character with great beauty in people of great moral fortitude, and even more curious in those with foreign accents and speakers of foreign languages, lisps appear. And she concludes pretty quickly early on, we really don't know anything from this about whether or not Conan Doyle thought his lisping characters neurotic or stressed. But she does point out, too, that at least a few of his lisping characters pretended to be someone they were not for criminal purposes. So, for example, the bank robber in The Resident Patient, Hayward. And I must admit that before I looked at this paper, if someone had asked me about people who lisp in the canon, I would have been blank on the subject. I've just never even noticed it. But she points out that Hayward, who's described by Conan Doyle as a tall young man, surprisingly handsome, with a dark, fierce face. Now, again, this is one of the bank robbers. And he has the limbs and chest of a Hercules. So this is someone who is, very healthy and handsome, that he spoke with a slight lisp. And, Conan Doyle seems to be making a point of exaggerating his good looks to contrast him with this slight lisp. And Hayward says, "Yeah, you will excuse my coming in, doctor," said Hayward to me, speaking English with a slight lisp.
This contrast between the arms and chest of a Hercules and speaking with a slight lisp, I'm sorry I have to do this, but once again, I'll go back to the Warner Brothers cartoon empire. There there was some cartoon. I don't remember exactly which one it was, but it was in the Bugs Bunny 1950s era, I think. There was this huge elephant, and he spoke in a kind of was it Joe? I'm thinking of one of the later Three Stooges, Curly Joe. He said he kind of got up on one foot and goes, "I'll give you such a pinch."
Oh, that's like Joe Besser.
Joe Besser, yeah.
Joe Besser. Yeah.
And it was again that kind of contrast between physical bulk and the lisping type sound there.
Yeah. Well, but yeah, you like have spent a lot of time enjoying animation and people. You mentioned Mel Blanc and others, but Nancy Cartwright, too, who voices Bart Simpson, who has many other voices in her repertoire as well. Has spoken and taught about the creation of a character, of an audible character, and how to develop that and bring that to life. And that's a lovely example.
Yeah. Well, and then the other instance, and actually this story contains two instances. The Hound of the Baskervilles. We find Beryl Stapleton, who, of course, is enamored with Henry Baskerville, but can't do anything about it because she is married to, of course, her abusive husband, John Stapleton. And she's placed in a very awkward situation, and as a result, Anna very correctly points out that she is a morally ambiguous character. And she tries to warn Henry Baskerville, but only takes it so far, right? So she doesn't tell him the truth about the danger he's in. Kind of hints at it, and it's an example of kind of a character flaw combined with her rare beauty. She's called slim, elegant, and tall, with a sensitive mouth and a beautiful dark with beautiful dark eager eyes, and yet she possesses a lisp. I cannot explain. She spoke in a low, eager voice with a curious lisp in her utterance. So here we have kind of an exotic beauty. Again, she was darker than most women, a darker brunette than most women that Watson had come across in England. And of course, this is once again Conan Doyle making that reference to someone who is not from England, not from Europe even. We talked about this in an earlier episode with exotic beauties and how they were characterized, usually with some kind of suspicion.
Well, I have to say it's a lovely thing to point out, and there are a couple of things I really appreciate here. One is that it's not unusual at all in Conan Doyle that when a female character approaches, she really has this sort of hand grenade going off, center stage sort of impact. I mean, there are very few female characters in Conan Doyle's work who, are just sort of there, but this is, Beryl Stapleton's exotic look and her beauty, her beautiful dark eyes. And then, of course, the very clever way, as you just pointed out, that he uses the lisp to suggest that Beryl Stapleton, nay Beryl Garcia, is not from around here. Watson says, she's darker than any brunette whom I've ever seen in England. And boy, so she's native to Costa Rica. And then back at the house, back at Baskerville Hall, there is another character at Merripit House, the old manservant of the Stapletons. I'm sorry, it's not Baskerville Hall. At their Merripit House is called Anthony, or as Holmes deduces, Antonio, and he has the same curious lisp as Mrs. Stapleton. But the thing that I really enjoy here in the works of Conan Doyle is that Conan Doyle never, to my knowledge at any rate, attempts to recreate in the conversation or in the utterances of these characters that particular speech defect or characteristic. And I must say, it always drives me crazy when I'm reading, particularly in a detective story around the early part of the 20th century, where the author has introduced the Cockney character and then produces page after page after page, attempting to reduce that accent to the written page, and it just drives me nuts.
Well, there was one instance we know Conan Doyle did that, and that was with Steve Dixie. And the Three Gables, which was that was
one of the reasons
character.
why that's so of the several reasons why that's so embarrassing.
Right. No, that's exactly it, and it goes back to that Dickens example that I used from Hard Times. It becomes very difficult to read, and I think this is why when Conan Doyle says that someone has a slight lisp, you can almost gloss over it and not notice it. And for those of us who did pick up on Anthony here from the Hound of the Baskervilles, I think that's a great instance of this subtle similarity between he and Beryl Stapleton. And Conan Doyle could have been hinting at that TH that we often hear in Castilian Spanish, where they very specifically and intentionally pronounce their S's like THs. So it would sound like it's Castilian Spain. And that would have indicated that they were from a different region than they were purporting to be from. And once again, suspicion could have been shadowing them had Conan Doyle been more ham-handed about it, like you say. Incidentally, we did talk about South Americans in Sherlock Holmes in episode 134. We will have a link to that in the show notes.
One of the nice things at the end of this paper is that Anna mentions Conan Doyle's speech, and she refers to a film that exists that's easily findable on YouTube. It was made in 1927, so this is the early days of sound. And Conan Doyle, of course, would die in 1930. Actually, I thought it was after 1927. But anyway, she refers to the sound of his voice. And she says, even though the audio is bad, there is a faintly perceptible whistle whenever Conan Doyle produces an S sound, particularly on the words stories, so, and scientific. And she wonders, maybe Conan Doyle himself may have spoken with a type of lisp. And she says, if true, Conan Doyle indeed would be in good company, as Dickens also spoke with a slight lisp, as did Oscar Wilde. And that's a lovely observation.
Well, and at that point in his life, it's quite possible that Conan Doyle could have had falsies, and it could have very well been a dental lisp. And that...
Oh, well, that's true,
Yeah, and that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
If there was meaning in that remark, Mr. Holmes, I'm afraid it escaped me.